Hello and welcome to USA 2024 on the road. With me, James Matthews. I'm in a car park in West Palm Beach, Florida.
And me, Dominic Waghorn, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
And me, Mark Stone, in Washington, D.C.
Dom, Mark, we're 36 hours and more into this election day process. How are you finding it? Have you slept?
I got 4 hours, just under 4 hours sleep, up again, I think at 8:30 and out on the road trying to talk to people in Philadelphia and a bit further beyond. And still going strong.
Aren't we just? My election night trauma was on the plane down from Philadelphia, where we were, to Florida. I got a text from our colleague Dan Rivers of ITV, and he said, do you happen to have a spare poppy? I've lost mine. And it was then I realised, I've got two poppies, and I've left both in the desk in Washington, D.C. And I said, look, sorry, mate, I don't have mine either. If you find a supplier, give me a shout. Sure enough, he came up trumps half an hour later. He'd found a couple of poppies, and he got it from Richard Gaisford of Good Morning Britain. So there you go, British boys helping each other out. Every time I looked at the TV, Mark, there you were in the studio, analysing something along, on that Sky News election desk. How did you find it? Mentally stressful?
Very much so. It was long. It was really long. 12 hours in the studio in one slot, no ad breaks, straight through. It was an amazing night. It was a conclusive night, which I think many of us didn't expect. And now the ride begins.
Well, it was certainly quite the night. We'll be picking over the stats, asking what went so wrong for the Democrats and so right for the Republicans for weeks, I suppose, even months, years to come. Today, we're going to look outwards at what a second Trump presidency could mean for the rest of the world. Dom, you're, of course, our international affairs editor here at Sky. You've also covered every US election since the mid-90s. At least that's what I read on your Wikipedia page. Can you think of another US presidential result with the potential for such significant ramifications?
Don't believe everything you read on Wikipedia, but I've covered most elections. I think I missed a couple out. And this by far has been the closest and most extraordinary. Although I think what it boiled down to, what we discovered on the campaign trail in Pennsylvania, was actually a very familiar story, which was basically there were lots of issues and huge amounts of distractions, but essentially it came down to the economy. But what I think a lot of voters did say they were worried about was global chaos, was the wars overseas. We interviewed a minister who'd driven up from Texas with his son, and he said he'd come to campaign in Pennsylvania to make sure Donald Trump won so that his son, Abe, who was 14 years old, would never have to fight in foreign wars, as some of his friends had and had suffered hugely as a result. And I think that is going to really focus Donald Trump. And I think people like him will hold Donald Trump to account because he has promised, and so has J.D. Vance, to end America's involvement in what they've called forever wars overseas. Donald Trump is, in a historical sense, what you would call an American isolationist. He doesn't think Americans and money should be spent to fight wars in foreign lands. And what we've seen throughout American history is a kind of, George Washington advocated non-involvement in European wars. James Monroe advocated the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, saying that the old and new worlds were so different they should remain separate completely. So you should never get involved. And I think that, can see Donald Trump as part of that sort of tradition in American history. The catch in US isolationism, of course, is that you can stay out of foreign wars until American interests are so threatened, as they were eventually in both world wars, that you have to get back involved, and you often do so re-engaging at the point of maximum cost.
Yeah, and Mark, you were our man in Jerusalem for a number of years. The ongoing war in the Middle East and America's role in it, that's obviously been a key issue in this election. How significant could Donald Trump's election be for that region and that conflict in particular, do you think?
Well, guess which world leader was the first to message Donald Trump and congratulate him and make that message public?
Yeah.
It was, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu. And I think that speaks volumes about the relationship and how important that relationship between Israel and the United States is. in terms of what it means for the war there, the war in Gaza and the war now in Lebanon as well. Well, Donald Trump has made clear privately, and this sort of thing has been leaked, that he wants to, by the time he takes office, by the time the inauguration happens, he kind of wants these wars to be done and dusted. He wants them to be over. But Donald Trump is a guy that likes short-term wins. He doesn't necessarily think strategically long-term. And so I think there's a clear question mark over the extent to which the Palestinians will feel like they are getting something out of whatever resolution comes on that war. It's interesting, different world leaders, different adversaries of the United States, they were all paying close attention to this election, but they didn't all necessarily want it to go the same way. I think the Russians are probably quite glad that Trump won. I think the Iranians would have preferred to see Harris. It was his unpredictability, which I think scares the likes of Iran. The Chinese, I think they were kind of a bit on the fence, but the Chinese economy is in a really bad way at the moment. And so I think the idea of massive trade tariffs that Donald Trump says he would impose would be a big worry for Xi Jinping in China.
Donald Trump made it very clear on the campaign trail that he believes major changes to US foreign policy are necessary.
We have been treated so badly, mostly by allies, if you want to know the truth. Our allies treat us actually worse than our so-called enemies. But we have been treated so badly on trade and other things, on military. We protect them, and then they screw us on trade. We're not going to let it happen anymore. We're going to be a tariff nation.
Those aren't empty promises. Presidents have a lot of sway over foreign policy. They can unilaterally withdraw the United States from international agreements. And Dom, he got some practice at that last time he was in office, right?
Yeah, he did. But for him, America first is the priority. His critics would say that America first leads to America alone. And I think that the key problem with his policies in the first time around was his willingness to pull out of international treaties. So he pulled America out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement and also ripped up America's signature on the Iranian nuclear deal. And quite apart of what you make of the rights and wrongs of that, the problem with that is it means that America's word has ever since really not been as worth as much as it was in the past. And it's a kind of reminder, preparing for this podcast, of the 4 years we had with him in the past, of dusting off what I was saying back then. And one of the key things about, I think, understanding Donald Trump is his worldview is based very much on the New York real estate market he comes from, where you do a deal with somebody and one of you gains and the other one loses. And he was, throughout his 4 years in office, unable to think about deals that can benefit everybody, which is the basic principle, really, of the post-war world order. Multilateral cooperation, organizations like NATO, UN, the EU, IMF, and other organizations, where everybody gets involved, everyone does deals and treaties, and everyone benefits from it. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So for Donald Trump, NATO is potentially a rip-off. If America's putting a lot of money into it and not enough other people are putting in enough, then America is being ripped off. I think that will be a challenge for America, depending on what Donald Trump does next.
When people talk about, what would Donald Trump do? Maybe he'll leave NATO. The comeback always seems to be, yeah, but he needs Congress to be able to do that. Well, guess what? He's got Congress now. So there is potentially the chance that if he did on a whim decide it is a ripoff, as you say, Dom, then with both houses of Congress in the bag, and they both seem to be, then maybe he could do something like that.
Dom, do we have any indication of who Trump might pick as his new foreign policy team?
Well, there are a number of names, but I think that the Kremlinology of Trump's cabinet and working out what Trump is going to do in terms of personnel is probably not worth the effort. A, because I'm not sure he's decided yet. And B, even if he has, he may well change his mind before he gets into office during this transition period or once he is in office. But I think it's more interesting if you look at the names and the fact those names are being floated around about what that says about Trump's ambitions and where he might be going, rather than them being likely picks for his cabinet. Fred Fleitz is a character who has been a foreign affairs pundit on Sky News and other channels as well. He emerged as one of Trump's key advisors during the campaign, and he drafted a plan for Trump to review aimed at ending the war in Ukraine if Trump going to win re-election, which he has. And then Richard Grenell is a more controversial figure who threatened American troops being withdrawn from Europe if Germany didn't spend more on defence, very undiplomatically put up German backs, and that led to really, I think, real difficulties in the German-American relationship. These are controversial, prickly characters who are not going to help America diplomatically, but that gives, I think, a sense of where a second Trump presidency might be leading America. And I think it's important to say that these people are much more ideologically aligned with Trump than the people that sort of formed his cabinet in his first term in office. They were referred to as the kind of the grown-ups, the guardrails on Donald Trump. And I think it reassured many people that they were there. People like John Kelly, who has since described Donald Trump as a fascist, and other former military figures. I think it's fair to say that the people that Donald Trump will be taking to the White House with him this time are much more on his agenda and probably less inclined to restrain him from his worst impulses, in the words of 12 former White House Trump staffers who have sort of expressed a real concern about what this might mean for America and for the world.
We had John Bolton on the set in the studio last night talking about all this. John Bolton was once in Trump's cabinet, massively fell out with him. We asked him about this idea that many in the former Trump cabinet called him a Nazi. And he doesn't subscribe to that. And I thought his answer is really interesting. He said he's not a Nazi. He may have some of the characteristics of a Nazi, but to be a Nazi or a fascist, you have got to be an ideologue. And that is something that Donald Trump, he said, is not.
Okay, thanks, gents. Let's pause it there for now. We'll take a closer look at what Donald Trump could actually do once he gets into office. But before we break, let's hear from a familiar face who I spotted in the crowd at Trump's watch party last night.
Well, as you know, I've supported him loyally over the last 9 years.
Nigel Farage, British MP, of course, and friend of the new president-elect.
Needs to roll out the red carpet, and pretty damn quickly.
Welcome back to USA 2024 on the road. Whoever is in the White House enjoys an outsized role on the international stage. But the timing of Donald Trump's victory, with conflicts ongoing in the Middle East and Ukraine, how he plans to interact with the world once he gets the keys to the Oval Office, is perhaps even more significant than usual. So what do we know about Donald Trump's plans for handling the biggest diplomatic issues in the world today? Dom, during the campaign, Trump repeatedly said he could end the war between Russia and Ukraine in a day. When he was asked how, well, he had this to say.
I'll meet with Putin, I'll meet with Zelensky. They both have weaknesses and they both have strengths. And within 24 hours, that war will be settled. It'll be over.
That's not exactly heavy on detail. What do we know, Dom, about his thinking on Ukraine and Russia?
Yeah, well, the sense we have is both from Donald Trump and also others in the campaign team, but also from J.D. Vance, his vice presidential pick, now the vice president-elect, is that they want a negotiated end to the war, but they want to bring both sides to the table to negotiate an end to the war. And what they seem to be saying is that they will say to the Ukrainians they must negotiate a peace with the Russians, otherwise they will lose American military aid. So using that real threat as leverage on the Ukrainians, but also saying to the Russians, if you don't negotiate in good faith, then we will open the floodgates to military aid to the Ukrainians, and then you will pay the consequences. So for critics, obviously, that's going to reward Russia with a large chunk of Ukraine, about 20% of it, that it has taken by force. That will encourage other countries. It'll obviously not punish Russia for doing so. It'll confirm that might is right as a kind of global principle, potentially. But certainly from Donald Trump's point of view, he wants to see this war brought to an end. He likes to be a deal maker. And he certainly says sounds like he believes he can bring an end to the war.
Ending US involvement in foreign wars was something we heard a lot about while Donald Trump was on the campaign trail. But he'll become president, of course, at a time when there is a very real fear of escalation in the Middle East. His predecessor, George W. Bush, could offer him a cautionary tale on US entanglements in the Middle East. I wonder, could we see Trump intervene in the war there?
I think he's more likely to intervene as a deal maker again. I think he's offered very little detail on how he would seek to end the conflict in the Middle East, or what peace would look like to him. Donald Trump is seen as an ally of Israel, and don't forget he moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, which was something the Israelis had wanted for years. And Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was one of the first leaders, as Mark was saying, to congratulate Trump. But his approach to foreign policy has been inconsistent and rather disruptive. He's an unpredictable character, and I think in the Middle East, very volatile politics that is potentially quite dangerous and could lead to the situation there, which is an extremely tense moment going in a number of different directions.
I spoke to a Western diplomat here in Washington yesterday, and we were discussing what a Trump presidency, it was before he won, we were discussing what a Trump presidency might look like. And that diplomat said to me that they thought that Donald Trump would like to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and that he would try and do that by bringing about peace in the Middle East, which we kind of both chuckled about. But then you can see how that is something he would want to do, right? I mean, he's talking about his legacy. I mean, it may seem far-fetched, but this person I was talking to was like, it's not improbable. It could happen if he was to be able to forge some sort of deal, whether it be in Ukraine, whether it be in the Middle East, and get a short-term win, because that's what he's all about, short-term wins, then maybe the killing stops, as he said.
And while Ukraine and the Middle East are two areas clearly where change might be looming, relations with China could well remain pretty consistent and troublesome, especially when it comes to Donald Trump's favorite word.
To me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff. And it's my favorite word. If I run this country, if I'm going to be president of this country, I'm going to put a 100, 200, 2,000% tariff. They're not going to sell one car into the United States.
Tariffs. Not sure about the beauty of it, but Trump's tariffs have certainly had sticking power in terms of his stated policy. The Biden administration continued many of the tariffs that Trump adopted in his first term. Trump is likely to double down on them in his second. Mark, can you just remind us of what Donald Trump has said about tariffs?
Well, yeah, Donald Trump has repeatedly said that he plans to impose effectively across the board tariffs of either 10 or 20% on every import coming into the United States, as well as a tariff of upward of 60% on Chinese imports. And that, of course, is in a bid to encourage to bring back manufacturing to the United States, reopen the factories. That's what he promised to do when he was first elected. That is what he's promising to do again. It is classic populism, and in this interconnected world, it's hard quite to see how that is going to work. He promised to reopen the steel mills in places like Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where you were, Dom, last week. They never reopened, but interestingly, a lot of the people in Pennsylvania are still voting for him again. So I think tariffs are potentially very costly for America, but they are also really worrying the Chinese, because, as we've been saying through the course of this discussion, Donald Trump is unpredictable. So he may well follow through with these tariff ideas, and the Chinese economy is in really not a very good state at the moment. So the prospect of a downturn in the number of exports coming out of China going into America, not good news for China.
Yeah, the last time that Trump was in office, his tariffs on China sparked a trade war. There were efforts to de-escalate the trade dispute, but the COVID pandemic wiped out that as a possibility. Relations got worse, of course, as Trump labeled COVID famously or infamously a Chinese virus.
Yeah, and then there was this extraordinary kind of just a total hiatus, a total breakdown of diplomatic relations between America and China. I talked to a number of sort of high-level sort of diplomats, but also analysts, really alarmed by the situation, because these two superpowers were not talking to each other for quite a long time after the pandemic. It took a big effort by both sides to then re-engage and then put the diplomacy back onto a more constructive level, because whatever each country makes of the other one, it's so important, obviously, for these channels to remain open. And the question is, what will a Trump presidency do? I think there are a couple of interesting dynamics in the Trump-Chinese relationship. One is that Trump has a complicated relationship with China's Xi Jinping, its president. He regards him as both brilliant and dangerous. And he is with all of Trump's sort of relations with strongmen, of authoritarian leaders, he seems to just admire them more than he admires more democratically chosen leaders. One of the theories about this is it's because he was sent off to military boarding school at a young age, and he was bullied. But he developed a kind of respect and admiration for strong figures, but also military strong figures because of that military boarding school. And I think the Chinese look at an America under Trump in a couple of ways. On the one hand, they see a Trump-era America as just confirmation that America is in decline, and ultimately China will supplant America as the global hegemon. And that's encouraging to the Chinese. But on the other hand, they see Trump as a very unpredictable figure. The Chinese like to have the measure of their rivals, of their opponents, and know exactly how to predict what they're going to do. And Donald Trump is just unpredictable. And I think that disconcerts the Chinese. So it's going to be a relationship that's going to be fascinating. It's going to be quite scary at times to watch, but it's certainly going to be very intriguing.
And of course, on Donald Trump's agenda is the special relationship. Mark, I wonder how you see UK-US relations developing under a new president.
Well, I think some of it will be difficult, but I think the hope within British diplomatic circles and the British government is that the bedrock of the so-called special relationship, as the Brits like to talk about so much, survived the first Trump presidency, and it will survive the second. I mean, it's worth remembering that Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, was over here in the States at the UN General Assembly, and I know that the British Embassy here were doing a huge amount of work to try and secure a meeting with Donald Trump, and it paid off. It happened. Keir Starmer and David Lammy went up to the penthouse of Trump Tower in Manhattan and had dinner. And although it was clearly, they're not political bedfellows, it was, as I understand it, certainly the way it's being spun, it was a pretty good meeting. And Donald Trump told Keir Starmer that we're not political allies, but I can get on with you.
But obviously what's going to be absolutely crucial is, as it always is, the diplomats behind the scenes who make the meetings happen and smooth the potential tensions along the way. And obviously we have a very effective embassy in Washington who've already done a lot of work ahead of Trump getting back as the White House.
They've done that work because in 2016, they and many other Western embassies in Washington were caught short because no one expected Trump to win in 2016. So their contacts with Team Trump back then were non-existent. It is the job of the envoy of whatever country it is who's based in Washington. It is their job at this moment in time to present their government with all the information about both candidates and then present them with the contact list of all the people that will be in the winning candidates' cabinet. And I think the British Embassy here, from what I understand, have been putting a lot of groundwork in and are in a pretty good place with Donald Trump. What is interesting, Dom, and maybe it's a bit inside baseball, but the names are familiar to people listening, I'm sure. Karen Pierce may be a name people don't know. She's the outgoing British ambassador. But there are some names about who could replace her. One, Peter Mandelson, is an option. David Miliband is another option. Valerie Amos, Baroness Amos as well. All of these people would have been perhaps more suited to a Harris presidency than a Trump presidency. So maybe they'll be back to the drawing board to find a replacement for Karen Pierce when she leaves in January. Or maybe they'll try and extend her, because I think some see her as a bit of a Trump whisperer.
I think the problem for us predicting what this presidency is going to look like, but also diplomats preparing for it and tailoring relations ahead of it, is it's impossible to say whether Trump is going to be a fascist. I mean, is there going to be a more malign agenda, or is it going to be more chaos that we saw the first time around? Because I think that the saving grace of the first 4 years of Trump in the White House was it was more chaos than malevolence, and we just don't know at this stage exactly what he plans to do with his second term in power.
All right, Dom, Mark, many thanks indeed for that. On that note, we end today's episode of USA 2024 On the Road. Thank you for joining us. Speak to you tomorrow.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.